Oh, goodness. I don't live with as many petty people as you do, apparently. I don't know. It's fun to laugh at kids. Those are easy, right? It's not funny when adults act like that, is it? Adults do the same exact thing. It's just not nearly as funny. I was sitting in a ice cream shop one time getting some, I actually hated it. I didn't even want any of the ice cream. I was just there, okay? And I saw this man at the register. He's getting his ice cream. He's paying for it, and he began screaming. Like not a complaining, but like an aggressive, angry screaming at this young teenage boy who's given him incorrect change. Now, we're not talking like he handed him a $100 bill and he gave him like $2 back, okay? We're talking like this guy was freaking out over nickels and dimes. The guy's fumbling around trying to compose himself and do math while some man's just screaming at him in public. That's not real funny, is it? I saw a story about these two neighbors who had a years-long feud over a property line and just kept building until one of the neighbors decided to build a fence on what they believed to be their property, but they built the fence out of old used tires just to kind of like get at the other person. It's kind of funny if it's not your property line, right? Doc has a friend, and I think you should consider the quality of Doc's friends here, okay? Doc had a friend who was a Christian brother who murdered someone over a property line dispute. And it's kind of a shocking story, isn't it? And at the same time, it's not really a shocking story because we've heard these kinds of things before. You see, we live in a world where we all tend to subscribe to like this way of thinking. I'd rather be right, even if it means leaving a wake of destruction. I'd rather be right, even if it means I leave a wave of destruction. We want to be right. We want so desperately to be right that we will fight to be right and ignore the consequences. I'd rather be right, even if it means I leave a wave of destruction. We want to fight. And then you go back to this verse that we've looked at from the beginning of this series. It's from Luke chapter 10, and it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." According to Jesus, this is the greatest commandment, and it challenges how we treat our neighbors, those property line dispute kinds of things, right? But then Jesus tells a story. It's a story that we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And his story extends out who qualifies as a neighbor. And by the end of the story, the person who lives next door to you is your neighbor, but so is that guy who gave you the incorrect change. Everybody is your neighbor. And we're told to love your neighbor. This whole series that we've called One Another, it's all about how we can love our one another's. And here's the hard one for today. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. You see, love requires some submission, doesn't it? And I'm sure that that's a word that you probably don't want to hear. We probably need to spend some time defining it here on the front end to make sure that we're very clear and very specific about what it is that we're saying today. Because sometimes when we talk about submission, sometimes we're talking about authority. Most of the time we're talking about authority. There's people who are in authority and there's people who are not in authority. And so we have those who have authority and we have those who submit. Submission is kind of the opposite of authority. But that's not exactly what we're talking about this morning. Today we're going to talk about submitting to one another. We're actually going to be talking about submitting to someone's needs, to someone's good. Submission is choosing to place their need or their good, your one another's need or their good in front of your own, in front of what would be good for me, right? It's submitting my desires or my needs beneath what is best for someone else. It looks like a self-imposed limitation. See, love is going to occasionally require me to submit my good for your good. Needs of those around me will sometimes override my needs. And it looks like self-imposed limitations. It looks like deference. Submit to one another. Limit yourself. Place the needs of others before yourself out of reverence for Christ. We're not so good at that, are we? We're better at fighting. We're much better at it. We're much better at that idea of I'd rather be right, even if it means leaving a wake of destruction behind me, right? We're much better at wrestling than submitting. We're better at fighting than submitting. It's true of our kids and it's true of us. We're better at wrestling with our one another's. And anytime you wrestle your neighbors, you're wrestling God. And we're good at wrestling our neighbors. We're good at it. And we're also really good at wrestling with God. In fact, I have a story to show you that. There's a story in the Old Testament about this guy named Jacob. Now, you can find it. I'm going to fly through it, and there's way more than what we could cover in this time, so you can go back and read it. I'd encourage you to. It starts in Genesis chapter 25, but there's a story about this guy named Jacob. He's a fascinating character. Before he's even born, he has a reputation. Before he's born, he has a reputation. Within the womb, there's wrestling going on. He's a twin, and there's these two boys within the womb, and they're fighting before they're even born, and it comes to define specifically Jacob's life. During the birthing process, Esau is born first. He's the first son that's born, and Jacob is born fist first as he's grasping at the heel of this brother born before him. Their relationship is defined by wrestling and fighting. And so Jacob gets his name, and it literally means he grasps the heel. His name figuratively means he deceives. That's his name, and that's his life, and that's what he grows into. He is a wrestler first, and he learns to deceive and manipulate and lie and cheat. He does whatever he can get, or whatever he can to get what he wants. He is consistently putting his needs above those around him. It's his life story. Sometime late in their maybe childhood, maybe early adulthood, he's got this moment, this opportunity to take advantage of his brother. He's constantly working against Esau, creating conflict between the two of them, and he has an opportunity to trick him. And so Esau goes out hunting. He comes back. He's wore out. He's exhausted. He's famished. He asks Jacob for a bowl of stew. Jacob withholds it until Esau would agree to give him his birthright as the firstborn son. Which sounds funny, kind of a strange story, right? But what we know is that he's exhausted, he's famished. Jacob withholds until Jacob gets what he wants. He takes advantage of this situation and manipulates and tricks Esau. Eventually, Jacob even tricks his father in an effort to steal this birthright from Esau. And when word gets to Esau, Jacob flees. He takes off. He runs away to a distant land because he's avoiding a brother who is literally at this point in their lives ready to kill him. The relationship has reached that point. And so Jacob finds himself in this distant land. He's there for decades. And while he's there, he gets tricked a couple of times by this guy who ends up being his father-in-law. That's uncomfortable, right? But it doesn't make Jacob a better person. He doesn't learn from the ways in which he gets caught off guard. Instead, he just becomes better at his manipulation and deceit. And so he finds ways to take advantage of his father-in-law. And he kind of builds up this own little empire up until the point that it creates conflict with his father-in-law. And then he has to flee from this distant land that he's already taking refuge in. And he starts moving towards back home. Because everywhere that Jacob goes in his life, wherever he goes, he causes conflict and problems. But this time when he flees, he's not by himself. This time as he's going, he's got this massive group of people with him. He has multiple wives. He has a large family from 4 different women. He's got all this property and this kind of little empire that he's accumulated. And his journey this time looks more like a caravan. It's not very effective fleeing. And if you looked at him closely, you would think that he is blessed. It looks like he's blessed. It looks like he's got all sorts of stuff. It looks like God has taken care of him, right? A blessing to a man who's a wrestler and a deceiver. See, we assume people who are blessed are good with God, and it's not always the case. Sometimes the most blessed people are the biggest wrestlers. So Jacob's traveling back towards his home. He knows that when he gets back to the area that he's from, he's going to have to come face to face with Esau. He knows he's going to have to deal with his past deceitfulness and his past wrestling. And so he makes some decisions. And one night, as they're kind of camping out, he sends everything he owns, his family, his wives, his kids from all the different wives, all of his property. He sends them across a river and he stays behind. It's an act of cowardice. His concern is that in the night, maybe there will be a raid on him, and he doesn't want to get caught up in it, and so he wants to be separated from his stuff so that he can get away if he needs to. He's a coward. He's a liar. He's a deceiver, alone. And then we're told, very matter-of-factly, this is chapter 32 of Genesis, verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. It's kind of weird. Story just takes a turn. This dude just kind of comes out of nowhere. The story finishes almost as quickly as it shows up. It's very, very strange. We don't know who this man is, where he came from. There's not really any detail. All we're told is that they wrestled, and we're told that they wrestled all night long. Sounds strange. This mysterious man, at the end of it, at daybreak, arrives. He touches Jacob's hip and throws it out of socket. That's weird. Okay? Because they've been wrestling for hours. And then suddenly this guy has like supernatural power and just kind of, and it's over. It doesn't make sense, right? But this might be the first time in Jacob's life that he's ever had to submit. He's on the ground in pain, submitting. And the man begins to leave. Jacob stops him and asks him for a blessing. That's weird. Been wrestling this dude all night long, and now you want him to bless you? Doesn't make sense until you get to the end of the story. The man turns and says that he's going to change Jacob's name. That's weird until we get to the end of the story. This man decides that he's going to change Jacob's name to Israel. Israel has a meaning, much like Jacob's name. It means he struggles with God. He wrestles with God. Jacob, this whole time, this deceiver, this wrestler that he's not just been wrestling with the people in his life, but with God himself. Because anytime you wrestle with the people in your life, you're wrestling with God. Jacob also names something. He names the place in which all this happened. He calls it Peniel, which means face of God. Because Jacob believed that he had seen God face to face in that specific place and that he'd survived. It's a wild story. It's strange. Jacob wrestles with God. This isn't just some random man, but that Jacob wrestled with God. And then we're told that he spent the rest of his life walking with a limp. Jacob's story becomes Israel's story. Eventually, this family of Jacob's becomes a nation, and this nation takes on Jacob's name. They become the nation of Israel. And the entire Old Testament is the recording of the nation of Israel wrestling with God. There's great moments. There's times when the nation of Israel submits, times when they repent, times when they get it right with God. And then there's those other times when they just wrestle, times when they refuse to give in, times when they refuse to submit to their God. If you look at the Old Testament, you'll find a nation called Israel that is constantly walking with a limp. But that isn't the full story either. Because it's not just about Jacob and it's not just about Israel, but it's about us. Because Jacob's story is our story. Because our lives are full of moments when we have wrestled with God, when we want things our way, when we refuse His will be done. You know what I'm talking about? That prayer that Jesus teaches us where He says, "Our Father in heaven, thy will be done, thy kingdom come." We don't pray that. We don't live lives like that. We don't say, "God, your will be done." We live lives that say, "My will be done." And so we call issues of sin, we call them by lesser names. We rationalize our behavior. We excuse ourselves for the things that we do. We hurt people around us because we find benefit in our selfishness. Because we love to be right, we'll fight for it. We're wrestlers. Every single one of us. We're wrestlers and we're deceivers. But if you've met God, and more importantly, if you have submitted to God, then you too probably walk with a limp. There's these little reminders of who you once were. There's moments when you live in your deceitful ways, even though you've submitted in the past. There's a constant temptation to begin wrestling again, even after our submission. And I think that's why James writes what he does. It's in the New Testament towards the end of your Bible. He has this little letter that he writes to believers in God. He writes it to Jesus followers, and he tells them, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves then to God. They have submitted. He's writing to Jesus followers. They have submitted. Why would he say this to them? It's because they need to keep doing it. Because all of us, every single one of us, wrestle with God. Now, one of the pieces of Jacob's story that I've struggled with for years is so strange to me. It seems like God does something and it just doesn't make sense to me. God allows us to wrestle with him. I can get that. And God willingly wrestles with us. That's a little bit more strange. I somewhat get that. What I don't get is why it took all night long. I don't understand that. Why did God wrestle Jacob all night long? If all it took was for him to just touch the hip and end the fight, why didn't God do that right away? Why didn't he just walk up and just power punch him in the hip and then it's just done and over with, right? Why would he wrestle Jacob all night long? It seems as if God chooses to work with self-imposed limitations. Kind of like that definition of submission that we had earlier. If you go back to the story, we read verse 24, very matter of fact, verse 25 is just the same kind of idea. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, let that sink in. Because it's talking about God. It doesn't make sense the first time you read it, but at the end of it and you realize that this is God acting, this sentence makes no sense, right? After realizing he couldn't overpower Jacob, God couldn't overpower Jacob. Are you serious? That doesn't make sense. And then it says that he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled the man. It says this man, the man that Jacob believed to be God, couldn't overpower Jacob. That doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that God would show up in human form. It doesn't make sense that God would submit himself, that he would limit himself to the laws of nature. It doesn't make sense that God would maintain a physical presence that didn't dominate another man in a wrestling match. It's almost like God shows up in our world in human form and submits to man. He submits to the laws of nature. He submits to the rules of this world. It doesn't make sense. It's like God submitted to us until he didn't. Until he decided to just kind of touch the hip and prove a point. It reminds me of Jesus. It doesn't make sense that God would choose to be born as a baby to a poor carpenter and a teenage girl. And it doesn't make sense that God would show up poor and powerless, allowing authorities to rule over him, those authorities of parents, that God would have parents. That's weird. Or that the governors, the rulers of that time would have authority over him. That sounds strange. And it doesn't make sense that God would value others more than himself. I'm not making that up. That's straight from Philippians chapter 2, which is this moment where Paul writes this beautiful poem about Jesus and who he is and what he did. And part of his life, part of Jesus' existence in this world was to fulfill the idea that he cared more about others than he did about himself. That he saw us as having more value than he saw in himself. It means that Jesus lived a life of submission, where in his mind, he cared more about our needs than his own. It means that he lived a life of self-imposed limitations, that there were things he didn't do that he could have done, but he limited himself for our sake, at his expense. It looks like deference, choosing us instead of choosing himself. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that God would be concerned with the interests of others more than his own interests. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that God in human form didn't grasp at equality with God, that he didn't grasp at equality with himself. It's an act of submission. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that God became obedient. That's a strange statement, isn't it? It's an act of submission. It doesn't make sense that God became obedient to death. He didn't just come to be obedient to men and authorities and those who ruled over him in this world, but he also became obedient to the laws of nature. Let that sink in a little bit. That he submitted, the creator of all things, the one who created the laws of nature, submitted himself to the rules that he had created, to the rules that govern creation that he had made. And it doesn't make sense that God became obedient not just to death, but to a brutal death, to a humiliating death, to an offensive and public death. It seems like God submits to man, which makes me very uncomfortable. But I think it's true. And just as God submits to Jacob and the rules of this world up until he touches the hip, I think you can say the same thing about Jesus, that he submits to a man in the rules of this world up until he decides to burst out of the grave. And it doesn't make sense that God would submit to man except that he does. Thank God that he allows us to wrestle with him and then submits to our rules and our ways, because somehow in this wrestling with us, he gives us the opportunity to submit to him. He doesn't force us, because love doesn't force submission. It's a wild, wild story. It's a story that we celebrate every single week with the Lord's Supper. Every single week we come around the table and we remember, we mark a moment in time when the God of this universe chose to submit for our sake, out of deference to us, out of recognition that we needed something and he could provide it, even at his own expense. It's an act of submission. And so we take some bread and we take some juice and we honor God in these moments. We honor his sacrifice, what he's done for us, his act of submission. And for us, it's an act back to him of worship. And when we do this, we call these worship stations because there's a part that we play in this, not just of consuming, but of how we give back. We give back in the ways that we can. And in this time, we give back in a very literal sense financially. We have boxes at each of these worship stations where we give back our first parts. It's where the family shares the responsibility for the work of this family. And so we feel compelled in that way. And sometimes we feel so very compelled and we feel so overwhelmed by the grace and the work of our God, the ways in which he's served us, the ways in which he's saved us, that we want to give more. And so at each of these stations, you'll find a white bucket. We call those our generous buckets. It's a place where we take 100% of what goes into those directly back into our community to help meet needs of the people around us. All of these things are ways that we honor God for who he is and what he's done for us. Now, we're not done with this message yet. Doc preached 3 sermons last week, and I have to find a way to turn this into 2. And so we're going to pause for a moment. I want to invite you to the tables together. I want to celebrate the Lord's Supper. I want us to praise a God who submits for us. And so let's go to the tables. We haven't mentioned one another's yet. That's kind of the big idea. So man wrestles with God who's submitted to his creation. It's a wild, wild twist. A God that would submit to man, a God who puts our needs above his needs, a God who seems to self-impose limitations because he seems to value us more than himself. And then he invites us to submit to him. That he allows the wrestling and offers an invitation for us to submit because love doesn't force, it invites. I go back to this phrase that we started with at the very beginning, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Reverence for Christ. I think that's a huge key phrase in this statement. It means we're going to respect Jesus by doing the things that Jesus does. And if you want to see what it is that Jesus did and how he lived, we can just go to the verses that come before this in Ephesians 5. If you go up to verse 15, you're going to find this. It's going to say, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. Jesus lived wisely. He says, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Jesus made the most of every opportunity. It says, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Jesus understood the will of God. He said, don't get drunk, okay, but instead be filled with the Spirit. Jesus lived a life that was filled with the Spirit. We're told to speak God's words to each other because Jesus spoke God's words. We're told to make music for God because Jesus' life was a beautiful song to God. We're told to always give thanks because Jesus always gave thanks. And we're told to submit to one another. It only makes sense if it said that because Jesus submitted first, and he did. It's because Jesus submitted first. Jesus let our needs override his needs. Jesus' life was defined by self-imposed limitations. So can you do that? Will you submit to one another? Will you let someone else's needs override your needs? It's what love does. It's a call for mutual submission, each of us submitting to one another. It requires us to reject our own will for the sake of another. It requires us to give precedence to our others, that we would defer to others. And if you keep reading in Ephesians 5, some of you are going to know where this passage, this little verse comes from. It's in this little moment right before Paul teaches on marriage, parenting. He talks about the relationship between masters and slaves, and he talks about this word submit, because even in the hierarchy of roles, even in the context of relationships and roles, mutual submission can and should exist. Even in places where authority has been ordained, there's room for mutual submission. And so there's a general sense in which husbands are to have a submissive attitude to their wives because they're putting the needs of their wives before their own, that they're imposing self-limitations for their sake. Parents, you understand this. You do this quite frequently. Parents frequently submit their own will to the needs of their children. It's not submitting to the will of the children, but submitting to the needs of the children. There are moments when we self-impose our own limitations because it's what's best for them. Bosses will occasionally submit their will to the need of those who are beneath them. And it doesn't contradict or undermine the roles of a wife to her husband, or a child to their parents, or a worker to their employer. Mutual submission is expected even in the relationships that have ordained authority between two parties. And this isn't the only place that you're going to find this idea. You can see this in 1 Peter chapter 5, where it says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. The younger are supposed to submit to those who are older. It's a place of hierarchy and authority. Doc has some things he needs me to say. Doc wants everyone to understand that he's older than me, and that he has demanded that I point out his age, and also that he has authority over me, which we'll maintain for the next 10 months. But who's counting, right? I've properly submitted by saying exactly what he wanted me to say. But that's not the whole verse. Peter continues. He says, clothe yourselves, all of you. That's an important phrase. With humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Yeah, it's true that if you're younger, you should be respectful to the elders. You should submit to the authority of those who are over you. But that phrase, all of us, is so important. Because all of us includes all of us. All of us are supposed to be clothed in humility toward one another. All of us in humility are elevating the needs of those around us before ourselves. It's an act of submission that you cannot submit without humility. All of us includes people in position of authority. Even those in authority should submit to the needs of the people around them. And guys, there's something really big on the line here. There's this other passage in 1 Corinthians 6. Paul's writing this letter to a church that has major, major problems. There's tons of issues within the church, tons of fighting that's taking place. And so he tells them the court cases are causing a black eye in your community. That's a little insight into something that's going on there, right? The church has had so much conflict within itself that they're taking each other to court. They're taking the issues that exist within the family, within the church, and they're bringing them into the public for the world to rule what should be happening within these relationships. You see the danger here? Man, it's disappointing. It's ugly. Paul calls it a black eye. And he says, wouldn't it be far better to just take it? To let yourselves be wronged and forget it? All you're doing is providing more fuel for more wrong, more injustice, bringing more hurt to the people of your own spiritual family. The church has a black eye because conflict breaks unity and it inhibits the church's ability to do good, but it's even worse than that because conflict in the church leads to more wrong and more injustice and more hurt to one another. Because when two people who want to wrestle start wrestling, they're never going to stop, are they? Man, it's a black eye on the church because the world is watching. When we don't submit to one another, we give those outside of Christ an excuse to not be a part of us. We're basically encouraging people to continue on their path to hell. Because our greatest testimony to the work of Jesus in our lives is our ability to act differently than the world. But a church that's wrestling one another doesn't look different than the rest of the world. Because the world is selfish. We're called to be selfless. The world is prideful. We're called to be humble. The world is hateful. We're called to be graceful. The world wrestles. We're called to submit. And can we recognize that this moment we live in is tough? The political climate right now is the antithesis of self-imposed limitations. The opposite of submission, isn't it? American politics right now looks like wrestling between two parties, seeing what one side can take from the other. And it's easy for us to fall into that mindset. It's that mindset that we mentioned at the beginning, the I'd rather be right, even if it means leaving a wake of destruction. Submission says something very different. Submission says, I'd rather elevate you or lower myself than to destroy what God has built. That's the important piece. What God has built. And that's the heart. And if you go back to that church in Corinth, how is conflict resolved? Someone has to submit. Someone has to recognize that it's better to take a loss within the family than it is to create loss for others. And you may not feel good about that. I don't feel good about that. But it's what God does. Jesus' followers don't insist on getting their own way because Jesus didn't insist on getting his own way. Jesus took losses for God. Will you take losses for the good of God? Will you let someone make a comment without having to argue or correct them? That's tough. That's just one example. Can you do that for God? It would be an act of submission. And it's better to be wronged than to be right at the expense of someone else. Sometimes what is good for God isn't good for me. Jesus followers will do it anyway. When I submit to you, it's an act of submission to my God. So can you submit? Will you submit? It's going to require some changes of attitude. Maybe you've wrestled with God long enough that it's time for you to submit to him, maybe for the first time, or maybe you need to submit to God again. You've submitted at some point in your life, but you've grown quite comfortable with wrestling again, and it's time for you to get right with God. You see, our relationship with God is based on our willingness to submit to him. But our relationship with God is built on the fact that God was willing to submit to us first. That God became man, that he submitted to his creation for our benefit because our needs were more important than his needs. Jesus chose self-imposed limitations. God became man, lived like a man, died like a man for us. So can you submit to one another? Will you care more about the benefit of others before yourself? Will you shift your attention from yourself to the others around you? Can you lower yourself? Can you elevate others? Maybe you need to make a decision of some kind this morning. I'd love to have that conversation with you. I'll be sitting right up front. We're going to have some time of worship still before we're done here. But I'd love to have that conversation. We can do that up front. You can go. We have an elder in the prayer room who'd love to pray with you and talk about you, or talk with things with you, not about you. Feel free to have that conversation with me after the service as well. Don't let these moments slip by you, all right? Don't let these moments get away from you. That when we're nudged by the Spirit, we need to respond. And so feel free to do so. Let's stand, let's worship our God.